This week we're going to learn about how to teach vocabulary in the content areas. So we have several goals for this recording. First, we're going to identify some reasons why teaching vocabulary in the content areas is important. Then we are going to talk about how you can identify words that are appropriate for teaching in the content areas. And finally, we are going to explain different strategies that you can use for teaching vocabulary. So to begin, vocabulary is one of the 5 essential components of being able to read well. About 15 years ago, as of this recording, the National Reading Panel came out with a report, and they identified these 5 different components of reading. One being phonemic awareness, which is the ability to discriminate speech sounds. 2 is phonics. 3 was fluency, which is the rate at which a person reads, the rapid recognition of words, as well as the sort of expression that a person uses when reading. 4th was vocabulary, and 5th was comprehension. And comprehension is usually considered to be one of the most important goals of reading instruction, because that's the whole idea behind reading, is to be able to construct meaning. And vocabulary has a very important role in comprehension, which seems really obvious, right? If you don't understand the words that you're reading, then you're not constructing meaning. So vocabulary is really critical to comprehension. And for you as a teacher of content, vocabulary is especially important because much of learning in the content areas involves reading textbooks and reading other materials that you bring into your classroom. So if students have a problem with vocabulary, then they're also going to have a problem with comprehension, and they're going to have a hard time learning the content. It's also important for you to be aware that good vocabulary is linked to good comprehension, and when students have a poor vocabulary, they're at risk for failing in school. So now I'm going to talk about 3 different tiers or 3 different levels of vocabulary. And this is a classification system used to help you identify words that are important to teach. Tier 1 words are words that are really basic words that are used often in everyday conversation. Oftentimes they only have one meaning. These types of words like paper, desk, and pencil, like you see on the word cloud, are words that you really don't need to teach in the content areas. Now, if you're teaching English language learners, that's a different story. They might not know what some of these words mean, but for a native English speaker, these are just words that are very basic and don't need to be taught. Tier 2 words are more advanced words. These are the sorts of words that we see in written text, especially textbooks, but we don't often hear in everyday conversation. They're also words that have multiple meanings. For example, the word relative. Relative can mean, say, your brother or your sister or your mother or your father, but relative could also mean, like if you're comparing and contrasting 2 different objects. For example, you might say to somebody, well, that dog is really skinny relative to the other dog there, so it can be used in multiple ways. And Tier 2 vocabulary words are used across domains. These are words that students are likely to encounter in different content areas. For example, words like analyze and summarize, infer, hypothesize, as well as text feature type words like caption and visual, illustration. Those are words that students are going to see over and over again. And these words are certainly worth teaching because they are high utility words. Students are going to encounter them again and again, and they are certainly worth knowing. And finally, we have Tier 3 vocabulary words, and these are the words that are most pertinent to you if you are teaching content, because Tier 3 words are words that you only typically see in a particular content area or in a particular domain. For example, if you're an English teacher, words like allusion and allegory and symbolism are words that are highly related to your content area. Whereas if you are a geometry teacher, words like angle, polygon, geometry, parallelogram, pentagon, rhombus, those are words that we don't use in everyday conversation. We only typically use those words if we're talking about geometry. So those are Tier 3 words, and those are really important to you as a content teacher. So some researchers have come up with a framework for helping teachers decide which words are most important to teach. And certainly you want to select those Tier 2 and Tier 3 words to teach, but how do you decide which ones are most important for teaching, because you can't possibly teach every word that might be important, so you have to be selective about what you choose to teach students. So the framework involves words meeting these 4 different kind of levels. So one is critical before words, and these are words that students need to understand and have a really in-depth understanding of before they begin reading an assignment that contains the word. And you need a significant amount of time to teach these words, as many as 15 to 20 minutes, a really in-depth, you need to develop a really in-depth understanding of what the words mean. For example, let's say that you are going to read a chapter about teaching vocabulary. Very appropriate, right, for this particular recording. So a critical before word that you might want to teach students before reading that chapter would be the term word root. That word is really important because much of teaching vocabulary involves teaching different word parts. So that term word root would be really important for students to know before reading a chapter about teaching vocabulary. Foot in the door words are words that are necessary to understand before students begin a reading assignment, but they don't really require an in-depth knowledge. Just understanding the gist of what a word means is usually sufficient with foot in the door words. So you really only need to spend a few minutes going over what these words mean. Going back to our example about a chapter that involves teaching vocabulary, a good foot in the door word might be the word morphology, which is the study of word parts and patterns. That's a good word to know, and it's important that you understand what it means, but you don't really need to have a really in-depth understanding. As long as you recognize morphology means the study of words, then you're good to go. Critical after words are words that don't need to be taught before reading, but they should be addressed after reading. And the amount of time that you spend teaching them really depends on the importance of those words to your instructional goals. And critical afterwords involve words that are high utility, meaning words that can be used in a variety of contexts and that are used frequently. And they're also words that are defined explicitly in the text. Oftentimes, authors of informational books and textbooks are courteous, and they will identify unfamiliar vocabulary within the body of the text itself. For example, if you were reading a chapter about teaching vocabulary, a word like morpheme might be explicitly defined by the author of the chapter, because that's a word that a lot of people wouldn't know the meaning of. And if you don't know what a morpheme is, it's the smallest unit of meaning within a word, and sometimes it's a single word itself. For example, cat is its own morpheme. So that's an example of a critical afterword. And then we also have words that we do not need to teach. Those are words that students already know, or words that really just don't meet your instructional goals as a content teacher. Obviously, we don't need to spend any time teaching those words. And the most important thing for you to do when you select vocabulary words to teach is to keep your instructional goals and the purpose of the reading assignment in mind when you select words. That's really the driving force behind your word selection. So students learn words in 2 different ways, incidentally and intentionally. Incidental learning is when students learn words just by going through the daily course of life. For example, oftentimes we learn new vocabulary words just by conversing with other people. We pick up on what certain words mean, and then we begin integrating those words into our own vocabulary. Also, reading widely, meaning reading a variety of different genres and reading books on a variety of different topics. That's a really great way of developing vocabulary, because students will be exposed to many different types of words. And students also learn new words through context clues, and context clues refers to a strategy that good readers will use to figure out the meaning of an unfamiliar word. For example, if you come across a word that you don't know in a sentence, you will often stop and think about, well, what meaning would make sense given the context of the sentence and given the context of this paragraph that I'm reading. And other times you can look up the word's meaning to see if any of the definitions of the word would actually fit the context of the sentence. So that's an example of using context clues. But intentional learning refers to directly instructing students about the meaning of words that they're going to encounter. For example, one highly recommended way of teaching students new vocabulary is through morphology. Again, that's the study of word parts and word patterns. And morphology involves teaching students about word roots as well as prefixes and suffixes and what those mean. And in fact, I've done some reading on morphology, and there are some who estimate that as many as 70% of the words that students may encounter consist of at least some Greek and Latin word roots, or prefixes and suffixes. So morphology is a really useful way of teaching words. For example, if you were teaching students the meaning of the word photosynthesis using morphology, you would teach them that photo means light and syn means with or to combine together, and that would help students remember that photosynthesis is the process of combining light with carbon dioxide in order to produce food for plants as well as oxygen for us to breathe. So that's an example of morphology. Intentional learning also involves showing students how to map out the definitions of words using graphic organizers, and we're going to talk about some of those very shortly. And it's important to keep in mind that most words are learned incidentally. We just pick up on them just through the act of reading, talking to other people, daily life. But it is important that we still teach vocabulary intentionally, because there are many words that students need to know in order to be successful in mastering content. So you need to be mindful of that. So just don't feel like, oh, they're just going to learn words by talking and reading. I mean, they will, but they may not learn the words that they actually need to know. So here are some principles of good vocabulary instruction. So good instruction will explain the meaning of vocabulary words and also provide examples of how words are used. So you want to give students example sentences. You want to use the words in your teaching and in your explanations of content. Really important that students have an authentic understanding of how words are used. What's really important is that students are given multiple exposures to words in different contexts. That's really the key to helping students understand vocabulary. If you introduce a word once and students never see it again, what do you think is going to happen? Right, they're going to forget about it. But if students see a word over and over again, they begin to internalize it. It becomes part of their own vocabulary, which is one of the goals of vocabulary instruction, is for students to be able to use words on their own, both in their speech and in their writing. Also, good instruction actively engages students in learning new words. We don't want students to do passive activities such as look up the word's meaning in a dictionary and copy it down on the worksheet. That's very passive. That doesn't get the student thinking about what the word means and how it's used. So the strategies we're going to talk about a little bit later in this recording are going to be active strategies versus passive strategies. It's also important to keep in mind that it is better to explore a few words in depth and to really give students a full understanding of what the words mean than it is to teach a whole bunch of words but really only give them a cursory understanding of what the words mean. So you want to go for depth over breadth in this particular case. You also want to give students opportunities for hearing and reading new words or receptive vocabulary, and you want to give them opportunities to speak and write the new words that they learn, which is productive vocabulary. And finally, it's also important that you teach words that are conceptually related together, because it'll make understanding the words and remembering the words a lot easier. For example, if you are a science teacher, it would be really useful to teach words like carnivore, omnivore, and herbivore together, because all those words are related by the type of eater that an animal is, whether that animal is a meat eater like a carnivore, or whether that animal is a plant eater like an herbivore, and so forth. So it's really helpful to identify conceptually related words and put them together. As an example, in social studies, if you're talking about different systems of government, it might be useful to teach words like dictatorship and oligarchy and democracy together. So now we're going to talk about some different strategies that you can use with students both before, after, and during reading. And I realize I just said those out of order, but they're in order on the slides. So I'm going to go over these each individually. So one strategy that you can use to teach students new words before they begin reading is called semantic feature analysis. And with semantic feature analysis, what you do is you create a chart with columns, and each column includes a characteristic of the words that you are teaching. And on going horizontally in the rows, you have the different vocabulary words that you want students to know. And what students do is they go through each row, or they start one row at a time, and they read the characteristics in each column, and they decide whether or not that the vocabulary word has that characteristic. For example, this is a semantic feature analysis chart from or related to the book The Rough-Faced Girl, which is a children's book. And as you can see in the first row, the vocabulary word is folktale. So then you would go column by column and decide. The characters in the story are not humans. Is that true of a folktale? If it's yes, then you would make a check mark there. If not, you would leave it blank. Then you would go to the next column. The story explains why certain things happen. You would make a check mark if that's true of a folktale, and you would leave it blank if not. So you get the idea. So you go column by column and make a decision about whether each characteristic is true of that vocabulary word. And this is useful because it helps students compare and contrast the meaning of different vocabulary words side by side. And this can also be a good study tool. So it's something that they can keep and then study from for a unit test. So it's a pretty high utility strategy for teaching vocabulary. This is one of my personal favorites. This is a graphic organizer called the Frayer Model map. And with the Frayer Model map, what you do is you list the vocabulary word in the middle, and then the remainder of the graphic organizer is divided into 4 quadrants. In the first quadrant, you have the definition of the word, and I recommend having students write the definition in their own words. You want to use kid-friendly language because obviously the goal is for students to understand the word. So if you're just copying the dictionary definition into the Frayer Model map, that won't really be useful. So you want to have, what I would do if I was teaching the Frayer Model map, and I have with my former students, I would talk about what the word means with the whole class, and as a whole class we would come up with a definition that we can all agree on and a definition that everybody understands. And you might also have students do this in small groups, but really you're the teacher and you get to make the call on that one. So we write a kid-friendly definition, then we write down characteristics of the vocabulary word or of the term that you have included on the Frayer Model map. In this case, I'm using convict, and I actually use this Frayer Model map in another class I taught where students are reading a book that is set on Alcatraz Island, and some of the secondary characters are convicts on Alcatraz. So I model how to do this as a teaching method to the students, so that's why I have this example here. And then in the third quadrant, we write down some examples, people who are convicts. So what we do is, as a class, we brainstorm some people who are famous convicts. And then we think of non-examples, and we think of people, who certainly aren't convicts. For example, Beyonce and Taylor Swift are definitely not convicts, so we list them there. And obviously the Frayer Model map works best for nouns, so that's important to keep in mind, but I find it's really useful, and I find that students do have fun with it, especially coming up with examples and non-examples of the concept. So a concept map can be done a few different ways. This is just one way, as you see on the slide. This is just a really basic one about weather. So as you can see, we have the word weather in the middle of the concept map, and then we have defining characteristics of weather branching out from the main bubble in the center. So when we think about weather, we tend to think about, well, what's the temperature like? What's it like in the air? Is there wind? And so on. I mean, this one is, like I said, extremely basic. They can get a lot more sophisticated in this, but this is just a general way of mapping out what a word means and other terms that are related to the word. So possible sentences is really a strategy that you use with students before and after a reading assignment. So with possible sentences, what you do is you identify pairs of words, or you could have, I guess, more than 2 words, but I would stick with a pair. And what you have students do is you identify a possible sentence, or they write a possible sentence that shows their understanding of what they think the word means. So let's look at this example I have on the slide. If you look at the line that says number 1 next to it, on that line that says words, I might list words like frog and toad. And then students would write a possible sentence that includes both frog and toad before they begin the reading assignment. So let's pretend that students don't know anything about frogs and toads. So a possible sentence before reading might be something like, a frog is a type of ice cream and a toad is a type of ice cream topping. Now obviously that's a ridiculous sentence, but for the purpose of illustrating this, that's my sentence. So then what students would do is they would complete the reading assignment and they would see the words frog and toad used in an authentic context. And then they would decide, was my original sentence correct? Does it reflect an accurate understanding of the meaning of frog and the meaning of toad? And with my example sentence, of course not. Those are, completely off base. So what students would do is then they would write a new sentence that reflects their new understanding of what frog and toad means. So the new sentence might be something like, a frog is a type of amphibian that lives in both land and water, and a toad is a type of amphibian that mostly lives on land. So their new sentence needs to reflect that new understanding. So this allows students to compare what they learned as a result of the reading and check themselves about whether or not they were correct in their understanding of the words. So a word splash is another fun activity that you can do before reading, and you can do a word splash in a few different ways. So a word splash is simply a collection of related words that students are going to encounter in a reading assignment, and they're displayed just like I have here, like on a PowerPoint slide or on some kind of classroom display. And I know one teacher who does this with the word splash. She displays the word splash, and then she calls on students who know what the words mean, and she has them come up and actually slap the word on the board or on the PowerPoint. And then as the student is touching the word, the student is explaining what he or she thinks the word actually means, and that way the whole class benefits from it. And then other kids can chime in and add to that understanding of what the word means, and so on. Other times teachers might want to display the word splash like this and then have students sort the words so they can try to figure out how are these words related. They can try to group them into categories as they see fit, and then the class can talk about how they group their words and what the words mean and so forth. So this will help prepare students for reading by giving them some initial exposure to the vocabulary words that they're going to encounter in the reading assignment. So another strategy is to teach students word roots, again, to teach them morphology, the study of word parts and patterns, by creating word walls. So what you can do with this is each week you can introduce a word root, what it means, and several examples of words that contain the word root. And you can do that at the start of the week, like on a Monday. Just take like 5-10 minutes and do it. Then you can create a word wall, which can be something as simple as a piece of butcher paper or a poster, whatever is easiest to do. And you want to challenge your students as you go throughout the week in your reading in other classes and in this class. Try to find as many words as you can that contain that word root. And as you identify words with that word root, you can come up and you can write it on the word wall. And students will then, make a list. And what you can do to kind of make it more fun is if you teach multiple classes, like if you teach like 2 English classes, for example, you could have this be a competition between different classes to see which class period comes up with the most words that contain the word root. And obviously you want to make your study of the word root of the week meaningful. So you might want to select a word root that makes sense for your content area. For example, if you're a biology teacher, a word root like bio, B-I-O, would obviously have a lot of high utility in that particular class. Or you might want to select a word root from a key vocabulary term that you know is going to be coming up in a future unit of study. So you want to make sure it's meaningful. Here's an example here. For example, if you're a music teacher, perhaps you might want to teach the word root fawn or phone, which means sound, and have students come up with as many words as they can think of that include that word root, like saxophone or homophone, xylophone, and so on. So students would create their own list, and at the end of the week, you would have a nice list of words that include that word root. So there are also strategies that you can teach students as they are actually reading a text. One important thing to teach students is signal words. Oftentimes, authors of textbooks are courteous and they will place a special emphasis on vocabulary words that they do not expect students to understand, or words that they don't expect students to be familiar with. And oftentimes authors will give students clues about what those words mean by using signal words such as for example, such as, and especially, that cues the reader into the meaning of the word. So we can't expect students to just know signal words and that particular device that authors use automatically. We need to point it out in a meaningful context. So if you encounter that in your textbook, I would point it out to students and do a think aloud, show them, well, I can figure out what amphibian means because the author uses, for example, amphibians include animals like toads and frogs. For example, is a signal word that gives you some clues about what amphibian could mean. Also, sometimes authors will, in a similar fashion, use synonyms and antonyms of unfamiliar vocabulary words in order to explain the meaning of a word, and that's another thing you want to point out to students as they're reading content area texts. And you also want to encourage students to use their knowledge of morphology, use their knowledge of word parts in order to unlock the meaning of unfamiliar words that they encounter in their reading. One strategy that I really like for having students utilize morphology is called DISSECT. The first step in this is that students discover the context of the word. They figure out how is this word used in the sentence, and they think about what the word could possibly mean. Next, they isolate the prefix of the word if there is one, and they think about what does that prefix mean. Then they separate the suffix and think about what that means, if there is a suffix, of course. Then they identify the root word and say it and examine it and try to figure out what the word root means. And then if those strategies don't work for the student to figure out what a word means, they can then check with somebody and ask. And then as a last step, they should try the dictionary. And try the dictionary is last because, remember, we talked about how that's a really passive way of learning new words. The dictionary should always be the last resort when you're trying to figure out the meaning of a word. So there are also several strategies that you can use with students after they finish a reading assignment. One is to have students listen to a podcast in order to reinforce vocabulary. And a podcast is, if you're not familiar with them, it's almost like a radio broadcast, but it's something that you can access at any time. It's on demand, and you can easily download them with an app on a smartphone or an MP3 player or, also just a computer. And you can either locate podcasts that other people have created, or you can create your own fairly simply and have students listen to those outside of school if that's a possibility. I remember reading an article that was I think it was in the Reading Teacher, about a science teacher in 5th grade who used podcasts to reinforce vocabulary, and she created different jingles and little quizzes in her podcast so students could stop and think about the vocabulary. And if you're interested in that, I'm happy to send you that article. It's pretty interesting. Another way of reinforcing vocabulary is to have students create word analogies to help them remember the meaning of new vocabulary words. For example, if students are learning in a science class about different classes of animals like amphibians and reptiles, they might create a word analogy like frog is to amphibian as Komodo dragon is to reptile. So they can help remember that amphibian and reptiles are both classes of animals, and they can also come up with an example animal for each of those animal classes. You can also have students play games like charades, and recall charades is when you act out a concept and other people try to guess what it is. When I was teaching 4th grade and I was teaching geometry, that's a subject that has just a ton of vocabulary that's important for students to know. For example, I had them act out, for example, different types of angles. Like I'd have them make a right angle or an obtuse angle with their bodies, and then other students would try to guess what type of angle they were trying to make. I also did the same thing with like line segment versus array and so on. Memory is another game. What you do with memory in this particular context is you have a series of cards, and each card has, you have pairs of cards. One card will have a word and the other card will have its definition. And you have a series of cards like this, and you put them down, face down, and what students have to do is when it's their turn, they pick up a card, and then they try to find the card that has, or that matches. So if they pick up the word or the vocabulary term, then they want to try to find the card that has the definition of the word. or vice versa. And if they don't have a match, they would put the cards face down and try to remember their location. So what you want to do with memory is try to come up with as many matches, as many pairs as possible. Another thing you can have students do is create jingles and raps in order to help them remember new vocabulary words. That might be a fun group activity that students could try. And they could set it to music, and they could be creative with it, and that could be something they could do as a homework assignment. And finally, another strategy is vocabulary bingo. So you would have bingo cards with vocabulary words written on them, and the clues that you would call out to students could be things like the definitions of the vocabulary words, synonyms or antonyms of the vocabulary words, as well as sentences that use the word but the word is deleted. So students have to use the context of the sentence to figure out the meaning of the word. So that's another way of reinforcing vocabulary. So there are certainly many other strategies that you could use to teach vocabulary, but these are just some that I think are especially useful. So if you have any questions about teaching vocabulary, please feel free to let me know. Thank you.